Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on the construction sector outlook. I'm Shannon Lewis at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And before I turn it over to my colleague, Ron Wirtz, I have a few housekeeping items. First, slides for the presentation and a copy of the video link will be emailed to all registered attendees next week. Second, today's webinar is a part of a series of webinars on regional economic conditions. We hope you'll join us for our next webinar in our series, which is Friday, May 19th at 9 a.m. Central on agriculture conditions. I've pasted a registration link in the chat box, and I'll paste that again later in the webinar. Ron will be entertaining questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box on Zoom. We'd love to get your feedback at the end of this presentation, so please take a minute to fill out the 3-question survey that pops up in your Zoom window when you exit the webinar. With that, I'll turn it over to Ron.
Thanks, Shannon. I appreciate the introduction. Thanks to everyone for showing up this morning. I think there's a lot of interesting things that we found out from this recent survey. Really glad that you are interested in it too. As Shannon mentioned, I'll be taking questions. I will try to wrap up by 9:30, including questions. There's a chance that I might go a little bit long because this one feels like there's a little bit more content in it. So whenever I stop, I'll take about 5 minutes of questions, and it might go a little bit over 9:30. And if you have other things to get to, I certainly understand. So thank you again for attending. So let me get started here. First, I have to give you the disclaimer that the views that I express here are mine and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. First, I want to also just give a shout out to my partners. For those that have seen this webinar before, you're familiar with the fact that we do this on a partner basis. So we partner with a lot of construction trade organizations across the 9th District who send our survey out to their members to get their input. We also share that data in greater detail back to the partners. So it's really a kind of a win-win sharing, information sharing kind of arrangement, and it works really well. And we actually are this is the largest construction focused survey among the 12 different Federal Reserve District banks, and we're very proud of that. And just a shout out to not only our partners, but also if there happen to be members out there that have taken this survey that are watching, thank you. We really see construction as a bellwether in the economy. We really pay a lot of attention to what firms tell us in this survey. They give us a lot of comments. We read all the comments, and we really pay very close attention to this survey. So without their help, without the help of our partners, without members responding, this really wouldn't be as valuable as it is. So thank you again for everybody's help with this. So let me tell you just a few details about the survey itself. It was conducted in mid-April, April 10 to the 21st. We had 254 responses, which is about average what we've been getting, a little bit lower than November by 20 or so, but we actually had a little bit better representation across the 9th District, and a shout out to Wisconsin. They had their best showing, roughly about 60 responses from Wisconsin. So we're always trying to up our numbers, especially outside of Minnesota, but we actually had pretty good representation this time across the 9th District. These results are a snapshot. I need to remind everyone that this was not a scientifically sampled survey. Here's the breakdown of who responded. So we asked them to identify what sectors, which ones of 4 different sectors that they respond to, and you can check more than one box. That's why the percentages here add up to more than 100. But residential and commercial, each of those had about 50% of respondents. Then you see infrastructure and industrial have a little bit smaller share, as I'll mention a little bit later. As a reminder, these firms tend to also be significantly larger in terms of their annual sales. So we do feel like even these smaller samples are pretty good snapshot of what's going on in those particular sectors. The distribution by sector and in terms of the firm size are pretty similar to our past surveys as well. So we feel good that this is a reasonably good snapshot like others have been in the past. But again, please interpret results carefully. So first little takeaway is just to kind of set the table. Revenue has been trending negatively, unfortunately still, and profits also, and maybe a little bit more so. These trends previous in November, for those that were there for that particular webinar, the residential sector in November was seeing more outsized poor results. We're seeing some of that leak into all of the sectors, but it is still affecting some more than others. We are seeing that cancellations are increasing. That's one of a couple of things that are a little concerning. And now we're hearing about more cancellations, more as a result of uncertainty, whereas before it might have been more supply chain oriented or for other reasons like inflation, cost creep. We are also seeing that the pipeline for new projects is also declining, and the backlogs that companies already have are shrinking. We know that there's a lot of challenges out there. Inflation, interest rates, labor really kind of lead a broad pack of challenges. I'll talk more about that. But there is some good news, or at least some less bad news for sure. And actually, I would call it good news. We do see that supply chain is improving fairly notably, actually. Inflation is clearly still a problem, but we are seeing evidence of it improving, and I'll give you some evidence of that as well. And we do see that labor demand is still very healthy. Firms out there are still having a lot of trouble finding labor, but their demand for it is still strong. So despite the other things, I really consider that a pretty positive outcome. And despite other things that that suggest that there are some challenges out there, the net outlook is still optimistic, which is actually an improvement over the last survey as well. So let's get started. So let's talk first about recent revenue and profit trends. So for those that have seen this before, just bear with me. For those that are new, let me just orient you to a lot of the charts, to the way I do a lot of the charts. So you'll see this type of chart really throughout this presentation. So in this particular chart, we ask about revenue over the past 3 months compared to 3 different periods. The previous 3 months, so quarter over quarter, and then year over year would be the middle bar. And then we ask them about expectations for the coming 6 months. I do this kind of graduated bar chart, and basically red means bad, green means good, and the deeper the color, the more on the margins it is. So how I read this chart is that for the most part, quarter over quarter, quite negative. I think part of that is seasonality. I don't know, it's hard to tease out exactly how much. The better comparison, I think, is year over year. And here we see that things are slightly negative. But then I would go down to the bottom one, and here's where we see that while it's fairly even in terms of those firms that are expecting a little bit of decline versus those that are seeing an increase, this is actually an improvement over the November survey. So that's good news there. And again, that's on a expectations on a year over year basis. So I wouldn't call it a good outcome, but it is actually better than the November survey in terms of expectations. And you'll see a little bit more evidence of that optimism as I go forward here. To just balance, so this isn't part of the survey, but I always like to kind of triangulate what I'm hearing from construction firms on what other evidence do I have that this is jiving with what I'm seeing on the ground. So this data from Dodge Data is a 6-month rolling average, and this is for the entire 9th district. And what you see here is that year over year, we only have March data, but if you look at the troughs each year in March 2022 and March 2021, we are roughly in the same neighborhood as we have been in the past. Now, what I would say is that you have to be careful about calling that a win because we know that there have been inflated costs. So all things being equal, the same number of projects, actually, we should be seeing slightly higher total spending in terms of construction starts with this database if all things are equal, and we're kind of seeing the same thing. So I think that is reflected in some of the results we're seeing, that some firms are seeing more negative revenue trends compared to those that are seeing positive ones, but it's really not that far off. I also have to note that there's been pretty strong building activity in South Dakota and Montana. Those states are actually less represented in the survey sample. So I think if we had a true representation across the entire 9th district, this might actually look a little bit more positive. So this has been a survey now for several years, and I always like to take a look at the same question over time. So here you see the same question, year over year revenue comparison. So quarterly revenue comparisons in each of the surveys going back to May 21st. And what you see here is that we started seeing slowing on this year over year basis last year, April 2022. Okay, and it's basically accelerated each of the last 2 surveys. It hasn't gone off the cliff, but there's a very clear trend that revenues have been softening for firms on a year over year basis. Also, in terms of that 6-month outlook, here's a little bit of, this is a good news, bad news. So compared to November, so the last survey, the expectations for the 6-month outlook have actually improved quite dramatically. Now, they're likely a seasonal effect there. We all know that construction gets busy in the spring and summer, so their outlook should improve. So if you go to the April survey, here's where I would say there's less good news. There's definitely been a pullback in terms of the same outlook a year ago this time. So I would say there's and it is roughly just slightly negative as well. So it's not only gotten worse, but it is overall slightly negative. So again, not necessarily a great outlook, but it was better than November. So let's turn a little bit to profits. Obviously, that's really important. I won't talk as much depth about profits, but here we see that profits have been negative, and they are actually more strongly negative. And I think it's because of all the challenges that firms are looking at as it relates to increased costs and other matters that really affect profit on a kind of an ongoing basis. Again, I don't want to say that this is good news. The expectations for the coming 6 months are improved over November, but I think we have to acknowledge that they are still net negative. So profits are not in a great space right now. So as I mentioned earlier, we have firms identify what sectors they work in, and again, they can recognize more than one. Most of them only recognize 2 at most, and overall they recognize about 1.5. So for every 2 responses, they're in 3 different sectors, if that makes sense. So in terms of how they look here, how I read this is going back to some of the earlier surveys, residential has seen a much quicker and more dramatic impact in terms of their revenue performance over the last couple of surveys. What I would say is that we're starting to see it leak into others a little bit. Here you see non-residential respondents are net negative in terms of their revenue over the past year. The other ones, industrial and infrastructure, still net positive. There's some other indicators that I'll show you shortly here that also suggest there are other struggles in these 2 sectors as well. And again, I noted earlier, we have a smaller sample among industrial and infrastructure. These tend to be larger firms, so I still do really think that what they're telling us is probably a pretty good snapshot. In terms of their the outlook by sector, in terms of the 6-month revenue expectations, here kind of the same thing. Much more concern in residential. We've known and we've seen evidence that residential construction has been pulling back. We know that permits, for example, in the Twin Cities is pulled back by about 40% year over year, year to date compared to last year. So this isn't a huge surprise for us. And I would say with the other sectors, non-residential is pretty flat. The other have a pretty good outlook for the next 6 months. But there are other measures that I think we have to really pay attention to and keep in the back of our head before we say, hey, the outlook looks great. There's some other metrics that suggest there are things to pay attention to for sure. One of the things that we pay a lot of attention to are project cancellations. And we are hearing and seeing evidence that these are still quite high, higher than we would hope. So the cancellations really started showing up back in April of last year, and they've remained high for the last 2 surveys as well. What we were hearing early was that a lot of it was due to cost inflation, the rising prices for everything that's going into building. Those were part of the reasons why cancellations are. What I would say now is that we are hearing a little bit more evidence, and again, this is only from comments, so this is more of a qualitative sense. I would say we're hearing more about the general uncertainty of the economy right now in terms of why cancellations are happening. In terms of cancellations by different sectors, fairly even. I would say none of them are on good space. And here's the one area where industrial kind of caught my eye. So it does seem like maybe there's something happening there that we hadn't seen in previous surveys. Again, take it with a grain of salt. It's a modest sample, but from a consistency standpoint, this is one that was more of an outlier than I've seen in other surveys. So we also ask respondents to tell us what does it look like in terms of new projects in the pipeline. And here we see, again, kind of a pretty negative trend. Public projects, not as much. That has been flatter overall, really throughout the pandemic. Private projects is where we were seeing really strong pipelines early in the pandemic when things were really strong. We're seeing it go a little bit more negative. And so in terms of differences among sectors, I'm really not seeing a huge difference in terms of what the different sectors are seeing for pipelines. None of them really very positive. We also asked them about backlogs. So we know that firms, carry a book of business going forward. That's how construction firms can kind of do planning, because it's such a labor intensive and a input intensive process. They have to get these projects on their books early so they can do planning. And what we're hearing is that backlogs generally are continuing to shrink, especially so in residential. I think in the residential, it's probably easier for a person a household to pull back on a particular project, more so than very large project that has been in the works for maybe years. Nonetheless, we are seeing a negative trend really across almost all of the sectors, infrastructure kind of 50-50. And I think the reason for this is not really all that surprising. We're seeing higher cancellations. We're hearing about a shrinking pipeline for new projects. So understandably, that means projects that are in the backlog that are ready to be done are getting pulled forward, and some are getting to maybe earlier than they originally expected. So that's shrinking the backlog that individual firms have. So let's talk a little bit about challenges. So in previous surveys, I've mostly been talking about the big three, that being supply chain, material input inflation, and labor availability. What this survey has done kind of for the first time is it's kind of turned into a big two plus lots of other things. Now, part of the reason there are lots of other things is we actually added two. We always try to adapt this survey to try to skate to the puck a little bit in terms of anticipating new challenges or other trends in the industry that we can learn more about and help educate our partners and their members on. So we actually added, because we've been hearing a lot about turnover and about ghosting and labor trends like that. So we wanted to ask about whether or not daily attendance of workers was an issue. We also wanted to find out how wage pressure fit in here as well. And so that's the first time these answers were included on this survey. So we don't know if they necessarily robbed from other answers in the past, or if these would have been issues all along. So I just want to state that up front, that got to take this chart with a little bit of grain of salt in terms of the changes you see in it. But what I am seeing here is that if you take all of the other bars off, material input costs, inflation basically, and labor availability are remaining significant problems. And there are a litany of other issues as well. Higher interest rates, obviously a problem right now, but we are seeing wage pressure and other things also be a significant thorn in firm size. Supply chain looks like it's gone down. Again, we don't know. From this chart, you can't tell whether or not it got simply overtaken by other things. There is one chart that I'll show you shortly that does suggest supply chain disruptions are actually improving. We did also ask, so there's obviously, with the First Republic failure very recently in the news, we know that banking events are also a new challenge. We didn't put this as part of the question regarding challenges, but we did ask a separate question as to what impact these banking events are having on business, not only from a project demand standpoint, but also financing availability for not only themselves, but their clients. And what we heard, the good news is that 3 out of 4 said really no impact. But that does leave 1 in 4 that are perceiving some negative impact. Now, we don't really know what's behind that, or like the degree of what they are perceiving as a negative impact. But we have to acknowledge that there are some firms and some projects that are probably in jeopardy because of what's going on. And more than anything, there's already a litany of challenges. And this is just kind of adding to the pile of challenges that are making projects more and more difficult. In terms of, there's a point in time that we want to know whether these are a challenge. We also want to know whether or not any of these challenges are getting better or worse. So we ask a question on a couple of different measures that we ask about. And here you see that interest rates and inflation still real problematic for firms. We are seeing, I'm going to show you some evidence that runs a little bit counter to that cost inflation problem. Maybe that things are improving, but maybe not improving fast enough. And then here's where we do see that supply chain is really showing that there's some real evidence of improvement in supply chains. Here, where is actually 50-50 on whether they're getting better or worse. That is by far the best outcome we've seen in this survey so far. In terms of pricing, here's where I would say there's some evidence of things improving. So basically, if you go back to the April survey, both at the wholesale level, that's the chart on the left, and the retail pricing, that's the chart on the right, both of them are seeing a fairly significant improvement in terms of really high price inflation. Now, what we have to understand is this is still high. So if we were to only look at the April one and not see any of the others, that would still be considered inflation that is too high for the Fed's comfort level. So we acknowledge that. We know that pricing has really been problematic for the construction sector, but the good news here is that we are seeing some improvement in terms of the overall levels, and that they might be coming down. Still too high, but at least some good news here. The other area that I still see a lot of positive news out of is labor. And this is not only construction, but I think in the economy overall. But if you only saw this and didn't know anything else, you would generally say things must be okay in construction, simply because if you are hiring, that has to show some confidence in future work. If you look at the expected hiring demand over the next 6 months, that's the chart on the right. It is improving from November. I would have expected that, but it is also very similar to what it was a year ago. I think we have to acknowledge that some of the demand for labor is driven by the fact that we've had persistent inability to find labor. So how much of that is playing a role here is hard to say exactly. But what I would say, the consistency of labor demand over the course of these surveys shows a little bit of confidence to me. I also just wanted to take a quick step back and show you what real concern over construction employment looks like. So if you go back to 2005, that's what this chart is, from 2005 and right before the Great Recession, when we saw a huge plunge in employment, construction employment, not only in Minnesota, but in the US. So if you go to the very right, I would say they're showing some volatility in construction employment overall in terms of the data, but it doesn't look like what it did 15 years ago. And I think that's another way to maybe put in context what's happening in labor markets right now. Worker availability, I won't spend much time here, still bad. It got worse from November, again, from a seasonality standpoint, probably expected, slightly lower than 2022 levels, but not in any appreciable sense. So labor markets are still very tight, as I kind of alluded to earlier. Wages, again, from the challenge standpoint, we are hearing that it is a very persistent problem. Wage pressure appears to be strong overall. Now, what I would point you to is the very right of the chart. So we ask about it over the past year, and then what they expect over the coming 12 months. And there does appear to be some pullback on future wage expectations. Now, there's two ways to think about that, really. And it's kind of hard to know which it is. This could be wishful thinking. It's not uncommon when firms give big raises in one year that they expect to not have to do that next year. I've seen that fairly repeatedly. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that conditions in this sector have softened, and I think there may be some good rationale why there's expectations that wages might soften a bit in the construction sector. Outlook, and this I believe one of the last couple of slides, and I'll be able to get to questions. So the outlook, the only thing I want to point out here, it's not dramatically optimistic, but it is optimistic on a net standpoint. There are still plenty of firms that are not optimistic, but more are optimistic than pessimistic. I think that's notable. And I think what's also interesting is that all of the sectors are also net optimistic. So I think that's something to also kind of take forward. So how do I explain the contrast? So a lot of the metrics that we're looking at, like in terms, especially future metrics, the pipelines going forward, things like that, really suggest there might be more poor conditions than what an outlook that is positive might suggest. So how do you explain that? I can't really, okay? It's too broad for an easy generalization. What I would say though is the sector has been kind of in constant challenge mode. Not only before the pandemic, when labor markets were still tight before the pandemic, there were other troubles. Feels like a very battle-tested sector. I am going to give you one comment though that really made sense to me, because I talked to a lot of firms, I talked to a lot of people in this sector, and I just thought I would share one comment that does to me feel like one of the reasons why the circumstances are as they are. And it's actually from the Minnesota Builders Exchange, David Siegel. He was talking with someone that basically the labor shortage maybe actually has a silver lining to it. And that silver lining is that the difficulty in finding labor kind of possibly had the effect of keeping this sector from expanding too fast, say like it did back in the early 2000s, when it was able to expand dramatically especially in the housing sector. Okay, it got overextended, and then as I showed in that chart, you kind of saw what happened to labor, construction labor. That really hasn't happened this year. So I think it's potentially had the effect of not allowing the construction industry to get too overextended in any particular area. And the other thing is that there are lots of cancellations that we're seeing. That doesn't necessarily mean they're permanent, never to be brought to market. That might actually be tomorrow's demand as well. So again, that's only my views. Go back to the slide I said earlier, just some interesting things as I talk to lots of sources in the industry, how to make sense of what's going on in the sector right now. So real quick wrap up. So revenue trending negatively across sectors, profits as well negative. Future activity looks a little tough. We're seeing an increase in project cancellations. We're seeing a reduction in new projects out for bid. There's smaller backlogs, all not great news. And then there's lots of challenges kind of on top. That's really, I think, creating some of these circumstances. But there are some fundamental strengths. We are seeing still strong labor demand. There is some evidence that price increases in inflation for material inputs still high, but they're getting better. And we are seeing that supply chain is seeing real improvements. And the outlook overall is still optimistic. So that's it for my formal comments. I just wanted to point out, if you like this and you're interested in other areas of the economy and what we're seeing in them, my colleague Joe Mann is giving a webinar much like this one on ag credit. Joe does a great job with that. I highly recommend. And then we also have a survey going into the field in hospitality and tourism next week. We expect tentatively, we're planning a webinar on that June 22nd. With that, I am happy to take a few questions. Shannon.
Well, thank you so much.
I'll leave this up, and then I will stop sharing my screen here.
Well, thanks so much, Ron. And thanks for taking some time for some questions. I do have a few that have come in through the chat box, but I'd like to start with this one. So the bank's general business survey in January found that larger firms were generally seeing better revenue and overall outcomes than smaller firms. Is that the same that you're seeing in the construction sector?
Thanks, Shannon. That's a great question. As a matter of fact, no, not exactly. There is some evidence, some small evidence that maybe large firms are doing a little bit better, but I think actually how this one probably changes is that what I see much more grouping in is by sector. And I think so if you happen to be a subcontractor, very often you are doing it in one of the sectors. So you might be a smaller firm, but you are tied to the larger firms kind of in the same sector. So I don't see quite the same dichotomy in terms of performance by firm size, which I think actually is a good thing in this sense.
Great, thank you. And then I had a question. You presented a slide that had specific activity from South Dakota and Montana. Based on your survey, did you get any intelligence on kind of what's driving that increase in activity in South Dakota and Montana?
In South Dakota, I can point right to Sioux Falls. They are having activity levels that are just off the charts right now. If I'm not mistaken, last year they did 2 billion in permits in Sioux Falls. You wouldn't see that. You'd have difficulty getting to that number in Minneapolis. So they have really been on a tear in Sioux Falls. And I think you see a lot of the same activity in places like Bozeman and the Flathead region in Montana. So we're seeing population increases in those places. And where you see that, you're going to start seeing more investment.
And then I have one more, and this is about housing starts. With such high demand, the question is, why is there continued weakness in housing starts when there's such high demand? Anything from your survey that would tease out kind of an answer to
Well,
that question?
Well, I guess what I would say is it depends on how you're measuring demand. Demand kind of would be, I look at permits. So that is demand. And what we're seeing is that there is falling demand in terms of those people that are contacting developers. I don't necessarily know about how this affects the speculative housing market. I don't think much is happening in that space. So then it is about a client reaching out to a residential developer and saying, I want to build a house, and then the permits get pulled. And those numbers are definitely smaller. Now, what I would say is certain markets, I know a couple of developers on high-end residential that are doing quite well, where there are not issues of financing. So if a person is paying cash, that tends to be in more luxury markets, you're not seeing the same effect. But the fact that material cost price increases have been so problematic, you're seeing the same house, the same exact house, see a significantly higher price just because of the increase in cost for lumber and steel and copper and PVC and all of those things. Now add on to it the fact that interest rates are also higher. You have kind of a double dampening effect on demand in general. And that does seem to be reflected in permits.
Great. Well, that's the last question that we actually have time for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and please remember to fill out the brief survey that will pop up in your window when we exit. We hope to see you on May 19th for our colleague Joe Mann's agriculture webinar, and we hope you all have a great day.